I wish you had never been born. Laura's voice was cold, her words sharp as knives, slicing through the tense air of the living room. Sophie, standing at the entrance with her small hands wrapped around her mother's old music box, froze. She was only 7, but those words burned into her soul with a force she couldn't fully understand. Her heart pounded in her tiny chest, confusion and fear washing over her. Laura, her stepmother, glared at her with those cold green eyes that never softened. Laura was tall, with perfectly styled dark hair, always dressed as if she was heading to some important event. But Sophie knew her well enough by now. Beneath that polished surface was someone who seemed to carry bitterness wherever she went, and Sophie was often the target of her venom. The silence after Laura's cruel words was deafening. Sophie's throat tightened. Her small, blue eyes began to water, though she tried to hold back the tears. She didn't want to cry in front of Laura. Crying only made things worse. "Didn't you hear me?" Laura snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "I said, I wish you had never been born. Everything would be better if you were out of the way." Sophie couldn't speak. She felt her grip on the music box tighten, as though it was the only thing keeping her standing. It had been her mother's, and now it was the only part of her that Sophie had left. She held it like a lifeline, hoping it would protect her from Laura's harsh words. Laura's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "You think clinging to that old thing will bring her back? It won't. She's gone, Sophie. Gone." A sharp pain pierced Sophie's heart at the mention of her mother. She could still remember her mother's gentle smile, her soft voice singing to her before bed, and the way she would wind the music box each night, letting the melody fill the room as she whispered, "I love you, my sweet girl." But that was a year ago. A year since her mother had passed away. A year since everything had changed. "Go to your room," Laura said coldly, waving her hand dismissively. "Your father and I need to talk." Sophie hesitated, glancing toward her father. He sat on the couch, his head bowed, his hands running through his thinning hair. He looked tired, no, more than tired. Defeated. Sophie waited for him to say something, to defend her like he used to, but he didn't. He hadn't, not in a long time. Her father, Henry, had once been her hero, but ever since he had married Laura, he seemed lost. It was like he had disappeared into some dark place, a place where Sophie couldn't reach him anymore. He barely looked at her now, barely spoke to her. The laughter they used to share had vanished, replaced by awkward silences and Laura's sharp, controlling voice. With a final glance at her father, hoping, praying, for some sign that he still cared, Sophie turned and walked up the stairs, her heart heavy with sadness. Each step felt like she was climbing farther and farther away from everything she had once known. In her small bedroom, Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, the music box resting on her lap. Her mother had given it to her for her 5th birthday, just before she had gotten sick. It had been a happy day, one of the last. Sophie could still hear the laughter that had filled the house then, the warmth that had once surrounded them. But now, it felt like another life. She stared at the box, the golden paint chipped in places, the carvings delicate and intricate. It was old, much older than Sophie, and had belonged to her mother when she was young. Now, it was Sophie's most treasured possession, the only thing that still made her feel connected to her mother. Slowly, she turned the key on the side of the box, winding it just as her mother used to. The soft, melancholy melody began to play, filling the room with its sad, familiar tune. Sophie closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, wishing she could feel her mother's presence again. But as the music played, something strange happened. There was a faint click from inside the box, a sound Sophie had never heard before. She opened her eyes, looking down at the music box in confusion. The lid had shifted slightly, revealing a small, hidden compartment that Sophie hadn't known existed. Her hands trembled as she reached inside the tiny space. There, tucked away, was a folded slip of paper. Her heart began to race. With shaky fingers, she pulled the note out and carefully unfolded it. The handwriting on the paper was messy but familiar, her mother's. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen her mother's handwriting in over a year. Seeing it now, it felt like her mother was reaching out to her from beyond the grave. She read the note aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Sophie, my love, be strong. There are things you must know." The words trailed off unfinished, leaving Sophie staring at the paper in disbelief. Her mother had left her a message, but what did it mean? What did she need to know? Her mind swirled with questions, but there were no answers in the note. Just those few, cryptic words. Sophie clutched the note tightly, her chest tightening with fear and confusion. She wanted to run to her father, to show him the note, and ask him what it meant. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Her father had drifted so far away from her, trapped under Laura's control. He wouldn't care about the note, just like he didn't seem to care about Sophie anymore. Downstairs, Sophie could hear the low murmur of voices. Laura was talking to her father, her voice sharp and demanding. Sophie moved closer to the top of the stairs, listening as their conversation grew louder. "I told you, Henry, she's a problem." Laura's voice was full of irritation. "She's clinging to that music box like it's going to bring her mother back. It's not healthy." "She's just a child." Henry's voice was weak, uncertain. "She's grieving. She's a distraction," Laura snapped. "You'll never be able to move on if she's here, constantly reminding you of her." Sophie's heart sank. She wanted to scream, to run downstairs and tell Laura to stop. But she couldn't. She was too scared. "We need space," Laura continued, her voice cold and final. "You and I need to focus on our life now. It's time we did something about her." Her. They were talking about her. Sophie's blood ran cold. What did Laura mean by doing something about her? "You're talking about my daughter," Henry said quietly, but there was no strength in his words. He sounded like a man who had long given up. "Your daughter is in the way," Laura spat. "You need to decide, Henry. Either she goes, or this marriage is over." There was a long, painful silence. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, fear creeping into every corner of her mind. Would her father really choose Laura over her? Would he let Laura take her away? Tears filled Sophie's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She ran back to her room, clutching the music box to her chest, as if it could protect her from everything that was happening. That night, she wound the music box again, listening to the soft melody, hoping it would calm the storm inside her. But all she could think about was her mother's note. "There are things you must know." What had her mother discovered? What secrets had she been trying to warn Sophie about? And why did it feel like those secrets were still hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The next morning, Sophie woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. The music box sat on her bedside table, the note from her mother tucked underneath it. As the sunlight streamed through the window, Sophie made a decision. She would find out what her mother had meant. She would uncover the truth, no matter how frightening it might be. But before she could, something happened that would change everything. The air felt heavy that morning, thick with an unease Sophie couldn't shake. She sat at the breakfast table, her hands resting on the music box in her lap, hidden from view. Laura was moving around the kitchen, her back turned to Sophie as she prepared coffee. Henry sat across from her, staring down at his plate, barely touching his food. The silence between them was suffocating. "Henry," Laura said sharply, breaking the quiet as she set her cup down with a clink. "We need to talk." Sophie's grip on the music box tightened. The tension in the room was unbearable. She knew this wasn't a normal conversation. Laura's tone was different, colder, and her father seemed even more distant than usual, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. Henry nodded weakly, but his gaze remained fixed on the table. Sophie could feel her stomach twist with fear. She knew they were talking about her. Laura had made that clear the night before. "It's time," Laura said, her voice low but firm. "She can't stay here any longer, Henry." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands began to tremble as she hugged the music box tighter to her chest, trying to make herself invisible, trying to disappear from this nightmare. Henry let out a long, defeated sigh. Where would she go? I've already made arrangements, Laura replied, her tone as smooth and calculated as ever. A house in the countryside, far enough that we won't be interrupted. She didn't look at Sophie, didn't acknowledge her presence in the room at all, as if the little girl didn't exist. Henry flinched at the word interrupted, but he didn't argue. Sophie saw his face crumble, saw the way he leaned back in his chair, giving up once again. Sophie's heart raced. Her mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening, but the more she listened, the more she realized Laura was planning to take her away. To abandon her. And her father wasn't going to stop it. I don't know, Laura, Henry mumbled, his voice filled with guilt but not enough strength to fight back. She's my daughter. Laura's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a thin, dangerous smile. She's a reminder of your old life, Henry. A reminder of her. You'll never move on if she's here. I won't let her drag us back into that mess. You said you wanted to start over, didn't you? Henry's silence was an answer in itself. He wasn't going to protect her. He wasn't going to stand up for his own daughter. Then it's settled, Laura said, her voice final, like a judge handing down a sentence. She turned to Sophie for the first time that morning, her eyes cold and devoid of any warmth. Sophie, go upstairs and pack your things. We're leaving soon. Sophie's heart sank into her stomach. She looked at her father, searching his face for some sign of hope, some indication that he would stop this. But he didn't meet her gaze. He just stared down at the table, his hands folded in his lap, looking smaller than Sophie had ever seen him. Now, Sophie, Laura's voice snapped like a whip, jolting Sophie out of her daze. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she nodded silently, standing up from the table without a word. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her as she walked slowly toward the stairs, her music box clutched tightly against her chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, each one pulling her farther into the darkness that Laura had created. When she reached her room, Sophie collapsed onto her bed, her chest heaving with sobs. She buried her face in the pillow, trying to muffle the sound, trying not to let Laura hear how scared she was. But it was no use. The fear was overwhelming, and it poured out of her in waves. After what felt like hours, Sophie sat up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She looked down at the music box, still resting in her lap. Her mother's last gift. Her only connection to the past. And then she remembered the note. With trembling hands, she reached for the hidden compartment, pulling out the small slip of paper again. She unfolded it, staring at her mother's words. There are things you must know. Sophie's chest tightened. Her mother had tried to tell her something before she died, something important. But what? What had she meant? Sophie's mind raced. She felt like she was missing something, like there was a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. Her mother's message had been clear, there was something she needed to know, something hidden, something dangerous. And Sophie had a terrible feeling that it had something to do with Laura. Hours passed, and soon Laura called from downstairs, her voice echoing through the house. Sophie. It's time to go. Panic surged through Sophie's veins. She wasn't ready. She didn't know what was going to happen. She grabbed her small backpack, stuffing a few clothes inside along with the music box. She wasn't going to leave it behind, no matter what. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. When Sophie reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw Laura standing by the door, her coat buttoned up, her keys in hand. Henry stood behind her, looking defeated, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sophie's heart ached as she looked at her father. She wanted to run to him, to hug him, to beg him not to let Laura take her away. But she knew it wouldn't matter. He was too far gone. Laura had already won. Without a word, Sophie followed Laura out the door and into the car. The ride was long and silent. Sophie stared out the window, watching as the familiar streets of her town faded into the distance, replaced by empty highways and endless stretches of countryside. The further they drove, the more isolated they became. After what felt like hours, Laura finally pulled the car off the main road, turning onto a narrow dirt path that led deep into the woods. The trees grew taller, their branches casting dark shadows over the car as they wound deeper into the forest. Finally, they arrived at a small, run-down house hidden among the trees. The place was old, its paint peeling, its windows cracked. It looked abandoned, forgotten by the world. "We're here," Laura said, her voice flat. She stepped out of the car, leaving Sophie to follow. Sophie's stomach churned with fear as she got out of the car, her legs shaking as she stood in front of the eerie, dilapidated house. This was where Laura was going to leave her. Alone. In the middle of nowhere. Laura didn't bother with explanations. She simply opened the door to the house, gesturing for Sophie to go inside. "You'll be fine here," she said, her tone dismissive. "Your father and I need some time to ourselves." Sophie felt a wave of dread wash over her. She wanted to scream, to run back to the car and beg Laura to take her home. But she knew it wouldn't help. Laura wasn't here to listen. Before Sophie could say anything, Laura turned and walked back to the car, leaving Sophie standing in the doorway of the house, frozen with fear. "Wait!" Sophie called, her voice barely more than a whisper, but Laura didn't stop. She got back in the car, started the engine, and without a second glance, drove away, disappearing down the dirt road. Sophie stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clutching the music box so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the empty road, hoping against hope that her father would come for her. But deep down, she knew he wouldn't. Slowly, Sophie turned and walked inside the house. The air was cold, damp, and musty, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. The house was empty, save for a few pieces of old, broken furniture. There was no electricity, no warmth, nothing to make it feel like home. Sophie sat down on the dusty floor, pulling the music box into her lap. She wound the key, letting the familiar melody play softly in the dark, empty room. Tears streamed down her face as the music filled the silence, but this time, the sound didn't bring her comfort. It only made her feel more alone. As the final note of the melody echoed through the house, Sophie felt a cold gust of wind brush past her. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat as she realized something was wrong. The door was open. The door creaked slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She sat frozen on the floor, clutching the music box in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the doorframe. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the tall pines sway like giants in the dark. For a brief moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, it was her father, coming to take her home, coming to tell her that it had all been a mistake. But deep down, Sophie knew better. Henry was too lost in his own grief, too controlled by Laura to ever make a move like that. The door swung open wider, the old wood groaning under the strain, revealing nothing but the cold, desolate forest beyond. The wind pushed inside, biting at Sophie's cheeks, and sending a shiver down her spine. She rose slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the open door. Every step felt like it took an eternity, her legs shaky beneath her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the door. As she gripped the handle to close it, the sound of something moving in the distance stopped her cold. At first, it was faint, a low, rhythmic rumble, barely noticeable over the howling wind. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, closer. Sophie's eyes widened, her breath coming in short gasps. She stepped back from the doorway, clutching the music box tighter. Headlights suddenly pierced through the trees. The rumbling sound turned into the unmistakable roar of a truck's engine. Sophie's heart leapt in her chest. She didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. Who would be driving through these woods at this hour? Who would even know she was here? The truck pulled up in front of the house, its engine rumbling loudly in the otherwise silent night. The headlights flooded the small clearing, casting long shadows that danced across the walls of the house. Sophie stepped further back into the room, her pulse racing, her mind spinning with fear and hope. The truck's engine cut off, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, the door of the truck creaked open, and a figure emerged from the driver's seat. Sophie strained to see through the bright glare of the headlights, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with slow, deliberate steps toward the house. As the figure approached, the glare from the headlights finally lessened, and Sophie could make out the man's features. He was older, probably in his 40s, with a grizzled beard and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. His face was rugged, weathered by years of work and the harsh elements. His jacket was heavy, stained with oil and dirt. He looked like someone who spent more time on the road than at home. Sophie didn't know whether to run or stay. The man stopped a few feet from the doorway, his eyes scanning the house and finally landing on Sophie, standing in the shadows, clutching the music box to her chest. His expression softened when he saw her, and he raised his hand slowly, as if trying to show he meant no harm. "Hey there, kid," he said, his voice deep but kind. "What are you doing all alone out here?" Sophie swallowed hard, her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to answer, but the fear had stolen her words. She could only stare at him, wide-eyed and trembling. The man took a cautious step closer, but he didn't enter the house. He kept his distance, respecting the fear in Sophie's eyes. "It's okay. I ain't gonna hurt ya. My name's Jack. I was driving by and saw the door open, figured I'd check it out." Sophie blinked, her grip on the music box loosening slightly. She hadn't expected kindness. Not out here. Not after everything that had happened. "Where's your folks?" Jack asked, his voice softer now, his brow furrowed in concern. At his question, the floodgates opened. Sophie's throat tightened, and the tears she had been holding back for so long came rushing forward. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. They left me here." Jack's face darkened at her words. He crouched down to her level, still keeping his distance, but his eyes were filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "They left you out here alone?" Sophie nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She wanted to tell him everything, the cruelty of Laura, her father's silence, the fear that had gripped her since her mother's death, but all she could manage was a weak yes. Jack let out a slow breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "That ain't right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Ain't right at all." He stood up, glancing back at his truck before looking down at Sophie again. "Listen, kid, it's not safe for you to be out here. Let me take you somewhere safe. We'll figure out what to do from there, all right?" Sophie hesitated. She had been taught not to trust strangers, but this man, with his rough exterior and kind eyes, didn't feel like a threat. He felt like a lifeline, someone, who could save her from this nightmare. Still, she was scared. She didn't know where he would take her, or if she would ever see her father again. But what choice did she have? Staying here meant being alone in the dark, with no food, no warmth, and no hope of escape. Finally, Sophie nodded, her voice small and unsure. "Okay." Jack smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "Good. Grab your things, and let's get out of here." Sophie didn't have much to grab, just her backpack and the music box, which she held tightly in her hands as she followed Jack out of the house and toward the truck. The cold air bit at her skin, and she shivered as she climbed into the passenger seat. Jack started the engine, and the truck rumbled to life, filling the cabin with warmth. Sophie leaned back in the seat, exhausted from the fear and the tears. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small sliver of safety. As they drove down the narrow dirt road, the dark forest closing in around them, Sophie glanced over at Jack. He hadn't said much since they started driving, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his jaw set in determination. "Why were you out here?" Sophie asked, her voice small and curious. Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward her, then back to the road. "I was just passin' through," he said gruffly. "Somethin' told me to stop when I saw that open door. Guess it was luck I found ya." Sophie nodded, though something in his tone made her wonder if there was more to the story. But she didn't push. She was too tired, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Instead, she leaned her head against the window, watching the trees blur past as they left the desolate house behind. Hours later, they arrived in a small, quiet town. The truck rolled to a stop outside a diner, its neon sign flickering in the dark. Jack cut the engine and turned to Sophie. "Stay here for a bit, all right? I'm gonna make a call, see if we can get you somewhere safe." Sophie nodded, curling up in the seat as Jack climbed out of the truck and headed into the diner. She watched him through the window, her mind still racing with everything that had happened. As she sat there, alone in the truck, Sophie's thoughts drifted back to her mother. To the music box. To the note. "There are things you must know." Her mother had tried to warn her. But about what? Sophie still didn't have the answers, and it gnawed at her, filling her with a sense of dread. What was it that her mother had known? What secret had she been trying to protect Sophie from? Suddenly, a soft, familiar melody filled the air. Sophie looked down, realizing that the music box had started playing on its own. She hadn't wound it. She hadn't even touched it. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as the haunting notes echoed through the silent night. The song was the same, but somehow, it felt different now. Darker. More urgent. And then, just as the final note played, she saw it. Tucked inside the lining of the music box, hidden in the shadows, was another slip of paper. Another note. Sophie's hands trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the fragile paper. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes widening as she read the words written in her mother's familiar handwriting. "He's not who you think he is. Be careful. Trust no one." Sophie's heart dropped. The paper fluttered from her hands, landing softly on the seat beside her. She stared out the window, her mind spinning, her world unraveling. Who was her mother warning her about? Sophie's breath hitched as her trembling hands released the note. The paper fluttered softly onto the seat beside her, but the words echoed loudly in her mind. "He's not who you think he is. Be careful. Trust no one." Her heart raced, the weight of the cryptic message pressing down on her small chest. Her mother's warnings had always felt distant, like a whisper from a forgotten memory, but now, sitting alone in the truck, the note felt like a lifeline and a curse. Jack stepped out of the diner, his broad figure casting a long shadow against the flickering neon lights. Sophie's heart clenched. Her mother's warning echoed again. Trust no one. Jack approached the truck, his face obscured by the dim street lights. Was this who her mother meant? He had seemed kind, rescuing her from that desolate house. But now she wasn't sure. The note had shattered the small sense of safety she'd begun to feel. Jack climbed back into the truck, shutting the door behind him with a quiet thud. He didn't speak at first, just sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "I made some calls," he said finally, his voice deep and measured. "There's a place in the next town over. A woman there can look after you for a while until we figure out what to do next." Sophie glanced down at the music box in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn edges. Her mother's note was crumpled beside her on the seat, the words burning into her mind. She had no choice but to go with him. But her trust, already fragile, was slipping away. Jack must have sensed her hesitation. His eyes flicked toward her, his brow furrowing in concern. "You don't have to be scared, kid. I ain't here to hurt ya. Just tryin' to help." Sophie forced a nod, but her heart wasn't in it. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She clutched the music box tightly to her chest as Jack started the engine, the truck rumbling back to life. As they drove away from the diner, Sophie stared out the window, her mind racing. Her mother had tried to warn her. But who? Who wasn't who they seemed to be? Laura, who had left her to rot in that house? Jack, who had come out of nowhere to rescue her? Or her father, who had abandoned her so easily? The road stretched on in front of them, winding through the dark, empty landscape. Sophie felt the weight of the music box on her lap, the familiar melody still echoing in her ears. The night seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. It wasn't long before they reached the edge of another small town. The streets were quiet, the houses dark, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light. Jack pulled the truck to a stop in front of a small, unassuming house at the end of the street. The house was plain, with faded paint and a weathered fence that leaned slightly to one side. It looked safe enough, but Sophie's heart still raced. "This is the place," Jack said, turning off the engine. He leaned back in his seat, letting out a long sigh. "Her name's Mrs. Harding. She'll take good care of ya." Sophie stared at the house, her hands clutching the music box even tighter. Her mind screamed for her to be cautious, to trust no one. But what choice did she have? She couldn't stay alone. Not anymore. Jack got out of the truck and walked around to open Sophie's door. She hesitated for a moment before sliding out of the seat, her legs shaky beneath her. The cold night air bit at her skin, and she pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she followed Jack up the narrow path to the front door. He knocked softly, the sound echoing through the quiet street. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the door creaked open, and a small, elderly woman appeared in the doorway. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she wore a long, faded cardigan that hung loosely around her frail frame. Her eyes were kind but tired, and her face, though wrinkled with age, held a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. "Jack," she greeted him with a soft smile, though her gaze quickly shifted to Sophie. "This must be the girl you told me about." Jack nodded, stepping aside so Mrs. Harding could see Sophie better. "This is Sophie. She needs a place to stay for a while." Mrs. Harding's smile widened, though there was a sadness in her eyes as she looked at Sophie. "Well, come in, dear. It's much too cold to be standing out here." Sophie hesitated again, her eyes darting between Jack and Mrs. Harding. The warning from her mother's note still pulsed in the back of her mind. But the woman's kind face reminded her of her grandmother, long gone now, and the warmth in her voice tugged at something inside Sophie, something that wanted to believe, even for a moment, that not everyone was dangerous. Slowly, she nodded and stepped inside the house. The warmth hit her instantly, a welcome relief from the chilly night air. Mrs. Harding closed the door behind them, the soft click echoing in the quiet hallway. "Come, dear," Mrs. Harding said, motioning for Sophie to follow her into the small living room. "You must be hungry." Sophie nodded but stayed silent. She wasn't sure if she could trust her voice right now. Everything felt like it was spinning out of control, and she didn't know who to trust. Her grip on the music box never loosened. Jack lingered in the doorway, watching them for a moment. "I'll be back to check on her tomorrow," he said to Mrs. Harding, his voice quiet. The older woman gave him a reassuring nod. "She'll be safe here, Jack. You've done a good thing bringing her to me." Jack glanced down at Sophie, his eyes softening. "I hope you'll be all right, kid." Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't. The fear was still there, gnawing at her, and she didn't know if she could let herself believe in his kindness anymore. After a moment, Jack gave her one last look, then turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Sophie stood in the living room, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. She was safe, for now. But the words of the note echoed louder than ever. "Trust no one." Mrs. Harding moved slowly toward the kitchen. "Why don't you sit down, Sophie? I'll make us some tea." Sophie nodded silently, sinking into the worn couch. The house was small but cozy, filled with the smell of old wood and lavender. The warmth from the fireplace bathed the room in a soft glow, and for the first time, in what felt like days, Sophie felt a small flicker of comfort. As Mrs. Harding moved around the kitchen, humming softly to herself, Sophie glanced down at the music box. She hadn't wound it, but she could still hear the melody playing in her head. The haunting, beautiful tune that seemed to carry her mother's voice with it. She looked again at the hidden compartment, where the second note had been tucked away. "He's not who you think he is." Sophie's heart pounded again. Who was her mother warning her about? Her thoughts were interrupted as Mrs. Harding returned, carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups of tea. She set it down on the small table in front of Sophie, and handed her a cup with a warm smile. "There you go, dear. It'll help calm your nerves." Sophie took the cup, her hands still shaking slightly. She sipped the tea slowly, its warmth spreading through her, easing some of the cold fear that had gripped her heart. For a moment they sat in silence. Mrs. Harding sipped her tea, watching Sophie with kind but curious eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but full of understanding. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Sophie nodded, tears pricking at her eyes again. She didn't want to cry in front of this stranger, but the weight of everything was becoming too much. The abandonment, the fear, the secrets. It was all pressing down on her, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold it together. Mrs. Harding set her cup down and leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's arm. "You don't have to say anything, dear. Just know that you're safe here. Whatever's happened to you, we'll figure it out." Sophie looked up at the elderly woman, the tears spilling over now. She wanted to believe her. She wanted to feel safe. But the note. The warning. It wouldn't let her rest. She bit her lip, her voice barely more than a whisper. "My mother, she left me a note. She said I should trust no one." Mrs. Harding's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something Sophie couldn't quite place. "Your mother must have loved you very much," Mrs. Harding said softly. "She was trying to protect you." Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I don't know who she was warning me about. I don't know who to trust." Mrs. Harding's hand tightened slightly on Sophie's arm, her eyes never leaving the girl's face. "Sometimes, dear, the people we think we can trust are the ones hiding the darkest secrets." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. There was something in Mrs. Harding's voice that made her stomach twist with fear. Something wasn't right. Before Sophie could say anything, the front door creaked open. Jack stood in the doorway. Sophie's blood ran cold. Sophie's heart stopped the moment Jack stepped back into the room. The soft light from the fire cast shadows across his face, making his features look sharper, almost sinister. He wasn't supposed to return so soon. Mrs. Harding stiffened beside her, but her expression remained neutral, almost too calm. Sophie clutched the music box tightly, the warmth of the tea forgotten. The words of her mother's note echoed in her mind once again. "He's not who you think he is. Be careful. Trust no one." She felt the walls closing in around her, her small frame trembling as fear crept into every corner of her mind. Jack cleared his throat, his voice breaking the thick silence that had settled over the room. "I forgot something," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Harding, then to Sophie. The way his gaze lingered on her made her stomach churn. There was something off in the way he stood, something unsettling about his sudden reappearance. Sophie felt Mrs. Harding's hand tighten ever so slightly on her arm, as if to steady her. The old woman's face was composed, but there was an edge to her movements now, a sharpness Sophie hadn't noticed before. "You should have told me you were coming back, Jack," Mrs. Harding said, her voice smooth but carrying a strange undertone. Sophie was just getting settled. Jack smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think it was necessary. I had a feeling I'd forgotten something important." His eyes flicked down to the music box in Sophie's lap, and for the first time, Sophie realized that that was what he had come back for. She instinctively pulled the box closer to her chest, her fingers gripping the smooth, golden edges as if it could protect her. Jack's gaze darkened for a moment, his jaw tightening. There was no more kindness in his eyes, only a cold determination. Sophie's breath quickened, panic rising inside her. Mrs. Harding leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "It's all right, dear," she said softly, but her voice was strained. "Why don't you go upstairs for a moment? I'll speak to Jack." Sophie hesitated, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She didn't want to leave Mrs. Harding alone with him. Something was wrong, she could feel it in the air. But Mrs. Harding gave her a firm, reassuring nod, and Sophie, though terrified, slowly stood up. As she turned to head toward the stairs, Jack's voice stopped her cold. "I think the girl should stay," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. Sophie froze, her hand on the banister, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Harding stood up now, her posture stiff, and there was a sudden tension between her and Jack that Sophie could feel in the air. "This is my house, Jack," she said quietly but firmly. "You don't get to make the rules here." Jack's smile faded completely. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Harding. That music box," he pointed directly at Sophie. "It holds something more than just memories." Sophie's eyes widened. More than memories? What could he mean? Mrs. Harding's expression darkened. "I know exactly what it holds, Jack. And I know what you're after." She moved slightly in front of Sophie, as if to shield her. "You're not taking it. Not tonight. Not ever." The realization hit Sophie like a wave. Mrs. Harding had known all along. She had known about the music box, about whatever secret it contained. And now Jack was here, not to help her, but to take it. To take the last piece of her mother. Sophie's legs began to shake. She wanted to run, to get away from both of them, but she felt trapped, her world spinning out of control. She clutched the music box tighter, her mind racing. What was in it? What secret had her mother hidden? Jack's patience snapped. He stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can keep this from me, old woman? You've got no idea what this music box is worth, do you? You think you can protect her?" Mrs. Harding's face remained calm, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a strength Sophie hadn't seen before. "I've protected many things in my life, Jack. You're not the first to come after this. And you won't be the last." Jack's face twisted in anger. "Move aside," he growled. "That box belongs to me now." Before Sophie could even react, Mrs. Harding took a step forward, placing herself between Jack and Sophie. Her voice was strong, unwavering. "Over my dead body." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Sophie's heart raced, her mind screaming for her to run, but she couldn't leave Mrs. Harding. Not after everything. She gripped the music box tightly, her knuckles white with the effort. And then, Jack lunged. He moved faster than Sophie could have imagined, his hand reaching out to grab the music box from her. But Mrs. Harding was quicker. She stepped in front of Sophie, grabbing Jack's arm with surprising strength for a woman her age. There was a brief struggle, a flurry of movement, and then the music box slipped from Sophie's grasp. It fell to the floor with a sickening crack. The sound echoed through the room, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Jack froze, his eyes widening as the music box lay shattered on the floor, its delicate lid broken in half, the once beautiful carvings now splintered and ruined. Sophie stared at the broken box, her heart breaking along with it. It was her mother's. The last thing she had left of her. And now, it was gone. But then, something strange happened. Amid the broken pieces of the box, something glimmered. Something small and metallic, hidden inside the hollow space beneath the music mechanism. Sophie blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she knelt down, her fingers gently brushing aside the broken wood. It was a key. A small, silver key, its surface worn but still gleaming in the soft light of the fire. Jack's eyes lit up with recognition. The key, he whispered, his voice filled with both awe and greed. I knew it. I knew she had hidden it. Mrs. Harding's face tightened, her eyes narrowing. You won't get your hands on it, Jack. Sophie's mind was spinning. What was this key? What did it unlock? And why had her mother gone to such lengths to hide it in the music box? Before she could process it all, Jack lunged again, this time with a fierceness that made Sophie stumble backward in fear. He grabbed for the key, his rough hands brushing against Sophie's fingers. But Mrs. Harding was there again, pulling him back with a strength that defied her age. Run, Sophie! Mrs. Harding shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Take the key and run. Sophie's legs finally obeyed. She grabbed the key, clutching it tightly in her hand, and bolted for the back door. She could hear Jack shouting, hear the scuffle behind her as Mrs. Harding held him off, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. All she could do was run. The cold night air hit her like a wall as she burst out of the house, her feet pounding against the dirt path as she fled into the woods. The branches scratched at her skin, the darkness swallowing her up, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Tears streamed down her face as she ran, her heart racing, her mind spinning with questions. What was this key? Why had her mother hidden it? And why had she told Sophie to trust no one? As Sophie ran deeper into the woods, she realized one thing with startling clarity. This key, this small, silver key, was the answer to everything. To her mother's death. To Laura's cruelty. To Jack's greed. But unlocking the truth might come at a cost she wasn't ready to pay. Sophie ran until her legs gave out, collapsing against the base of a large tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was alone now, truly alone, but in her hand she held the key. Her mother's final gift. Her final secret. She stared at the key, the moonlight filtering through the trees, and casting a soft glow on the silver surface. What could it unlock? What could be so important that her mother had hidden it away so carefully, even at the cost of her life? As she sat there, trembling in the cold, Sophie's thoughts drifted back to her mother's voice, her mother's laughter. She remembered the way her mother had held her, had whispered promises of love and protection. And now, even in death, her mother was still protecting her. Sophie wiped the tears from her eyes and stood up, her legs shaking but her resolve strong. She didn't know where this key would lead her, but she knew one thing for certain. She would honor her mother's memory. She would uncover the truth. And she would never let anyone take that from her. With the key clutched tightly in her hand, Sophie began to walk. She was no longer the scared, lost little girl abandoned by those who were supposed to protect her. She was stronger now. She had her mother's strength inside her, guiding her, leading her toward the truth. And no matter what lay ahead, she was ready to face it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie felt hope.